class, this is Laura Klein, and this is a short video about my just general thoughts about The Handmaid's Tale. So there are lots of different ways into this text and ways of thinking about it, so I'm just going to quickly talk about sort of the four main ways that I think about this text as I'm reading it. So the first is basically in the video that I gave you, with Margaret Atwood talking about the novel. She says that nothing in this book that hasn't happened, right? These are all things that have really happened, not necessarily in the United States, although some of them have, but around the world, whether they're more recent or very far in the past, right? Whether we're talking about the Puritans or we're talking about contemporary Romania, right? All of these are policies that have been put in place by totalitarian or theocratic governments, okay? And so I like to look at the novel a little bit as like a palimpsest of those, right? It's a big ball of different reference. So it's a really intertextually rich text. And it's showing different ways and methods of control that people have used against one another throughout history, right? And it puts them all together into this one big terrifying thing saying, hey, this could happen to us. And this is how it could happen through all these methods that have actually happened in the past, right? And it's not just with Nazis or just with Puritans or just with whatever, it's with all of these things, right? And there are places across the world that have theocratic governments, and there have been totalitarian governments many places throughout history, right? And even elements of that here in America, and elements of that in our own government, which isn't theocratic or totalitarian, but can take on some of those elements. There are also elements, this is number 2, of formal satire in the novel. And you can watch my video on satire where I'm talking about A Modest Proposal, which is a commonly taught satirical text by Jonathan Swift. This is a satire that is pretty dark. It uses a lot of elements of the grotesque, and you can see those. It uses there's a lot of critique in it of literal readings of what happens when we look at something very literally and take it that way. When we take something like saying women are better off in the home, and we take that to its sort of like utmost and most exaggerated conclusion. So you can look at different instances of that throughout the text. At the end of that video, I talk about how satire needs to have a way out. It can't just be bleak, 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 which is how this novel feels a lot of the time, right? This is a very bleak book. But at the end, we have the May Day resistance. And the May Day resistance, we don't know whether it's real or not, right? If you ignore the frame narrative at the end of the text, which I'll talk about in a minute, we have no idea what happens at the end of Fred's story, right? It's sort of left blank. She could be taken to her death. She could be taken to the colonies. And she also could be escaping with the resistance. And that possibility, that hope, is left open. And, I think Margaret Atwood, when she does that, she's telling us that, yes, all of these behaviors that lead us towards this horrible dystopia that we're in, the future world that no one would ever want to live in, these are human behaviors that have led us to that, right? These are things that humans do. But the other thing that humans do is that we band together and we resist. And she gives the possibility of the resistance as to show us that, hey, human behavior isn't all bad. There's also, this human impulse to fight against what seems unjust. Okay, and that's what we have in the May Day resistance, is the possibility or the hope for that. In the narrative itself, I mentioned the frame structure. We're constantly being given statements about the narrative. Our attention is constantly being drawn towards the narrative, right? So of Fred is constantly saying things like, I wish this wasn't the story I had to tell. I wish I had more time to tell this story. I don't know if this makes sense. She's constantly drawing attention to the fact that she's constructing a narrative. And that's how we get hints throughout of what's going to happen at the end, which is we find out that these are a series of audio tapes that have been put together by scholars in the future, right? And transcribed and decoded and translated, right? So we're about 50 steps removed, it turns out, from the actuality of the event, even though it seems so immediate in the reading of it, right? We're right there with Fred experiencing her experience. And what we end up with is a narrative that, because it's drawing attention to itself as a narrative, we want to put it into a history of other narratives like it, right? And in American literature, which Margaret Atwood is often grouped with, although she's Canadian, we have a history of slave narratives. So the famous ones are Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs, right? And these are ways that we often look at history. We look at people's first-hand accounts of their experience of history. And this book is also drawing attention to what we do with that, right? And then another famous one that this is alluding to also is the narrative of Anne Frank's captivity, or Elie Wiesel, Holocaust narratives, right? The idea of memoir as a genre, the idea of what it means to tell one's story and how true can it be. There's a lot of questioning about that throughout the book as well. Then we get to the framing device, which is one of the most explicitly humorous parts of the book, right? So the whole book is satire, but a lot of it is very dark, although some things are kind of funny throughout. And there are jokes, puns throughout that do, again, bring to light the fact that this is a satire. But really, the framing device is one of the funnier parts of the narrative, if you can call the narrative funny. And it's satirizing also. And it's satirizing the idea of academia and the idea of the way that we look at a narrative like of Fred's, right? And by bringing our attention to how we're looking at that from the future is bringing our attention to how we treat history, right? How we treat living history, how we treat first-person accounts. So we look at them as these strange artifacts, and we look at ourselves as so far removed and so far different. And so the people that are in the future looking at of Fred as past are saying, oh, well, we are so sophisticated, and we could never go back to that. And we instead can look at these really sort of arcane, minimal, unimportant parts of this society, right? You can look at the titles of some of the papers that are being presented at this Conference of Gileadian Studies in the future and think, oh my gosh, who cares about that? But this is really what happens, right? When we look at history sort of in a vacuum and we divorce ourselves, we don't look at it as a mirror, right? We divorce ourselves from it and look at it as an artifact, when really what history is a mirror. And so when we read Anne Frank's narrative or Frederick Douglass or Harriet Jacobs, what should we really be seeing? We should be seeing ourselves in the narrative, is what elements of humanity are still there, and how and what now disgusts us in a way that we can distance ourselves intentionally from that behavior. Whereas what this is showing is a different response to history, right? Which is a response that we often take, which is like, oh, the past is the past, let's put it in a little box and turn it into an artifact. Or literally, in this narrative, a box of audio tapes, something we can't even listen to anymore, right? The scholars from the future have to create a machine so that they can even hear the narrative. And so it's sort of showing and satirizing how history is forgotten, and how we lose track of ourselves in that history. So those are the things that kind of are interesting to me about the narrative and are ripe for analysis. I'm asking you to do historical analysis or different kinds of contextual analysis, and there's definitely tons of that in there. But remember that also at the heart of it, you want to say something about what Margaret Atwood is trying to do, what she's trying to teach us about ourselves and about humanity through this artifact, right? Which, although fictional, is based on a lot of understanding of humanity, of human nature, of whether you agree or not with the specific ideas of it, is a portrait of humanity that she's trying to put out there. So hopefully that gives you some ideas, some things to go off, or some things to disagree wildly with that you can write about in your papers. Thanks for watching.